I was a hacker because you get that adrenaline rush from the accomplishment of breaking into the system or finding a security hole or getting access to information you shouldn't have.
America is raising a generation of teenage electronics junkies.
It was in the early 80s that, for the first time ever, the public came to understand computer hacking as something nefarious and dark.
The FBI realized that these hackers have skill sets that federal agents and even local law enforcement don't know how to combat. And the government's reaction is to form cyber squads. Kevin's case was the catalyst for that.
Kevin Mitnick, probably the world's most notorious cyber thief.
Kevin ended up as the poster boy for computer crime.
The hacking of America. We've reported time and time again on massive computer hacks, everything from government secrets to data stolen from millions of retail customers.
We wound up in a situation where we're incredibly vulnerable. And maybe if we had listened hard enough to people like Mitnick, we would have built these systems a little stronger.
This is a story about obsession and unauthorized access, and that really pissed off the FBI.
You, sir, were once considered the world's most famous hacker. You're the most wanted man in computer crime, correct?
Yes.
Okay, you're a consultant now, but at one time you were, let's see, you bypassed the security systems of Motorola, Sun Microsystems, and Pacific Bell.
Yes, I did.
You served jail time for this. How much?
5 years.
5 years.
And a year in solitary confinement.
Why a year in solitary confinement? You don't look like a dangerous guy.
I'm very dangerous. No. The prosecutor had told a judge during a bail hearing that I could pick up the telephone and connect to NORAD and whistle the launch codes and launch a nuclear weapon. And because of this, the judge actually had a special order that I'd have to be held in prison without access to a telephone. So the only place they could put me was in solitary confinement. So I was there about a year.
Could you do that? Because that would be badass. That would be badass.
Yes.
Yes.
And I was playing this cat and mouse game with the FBI because I must have been a little bit crazy. And as they
were you actually taunting them?
Not taunting them, but I was watching them through the cellular phone system as I was able to work out their telephone numbers, and I hacked into the cell phone system so I can keep track of where they were. So if they got close to me, I would go farther away.
That's a good plan.
It's a really good plan.
Where does American ingenuity come from? It comes from creativity. It comes from people doing things that haven't been done before. The kind of people who are going to start Apple Computer and revolutionize an industry, very often that means that they're going to do things which are going to be out of bounds.
And that's why a lot of companies actually hire Kevin Mitnick right now to protect their jewels.
My case has brought a lot of awareness to companies, security awareness. Hey, there's threats out there. You need to do something about it. And what I get to do today is companies use me to test their security, teach them how to remediate those problems so a real bad guy cannot exploit them.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Ready, Set, Protect Community Roundtable. I'm Greg Knieriemen, and I'll be hosting our discussion today. Nearly every week, we hear about new risks to data protection and ransomware attacks. A number of recent studies estimate the average cost of a data breach to be over $3 million and takes over 250 days to identify and contain the breach. As a consequence, it's no surprise that data protection is one of the top IT priorities for most organizations. And with that context, I'm really excited to talk with our featured guest, the world's most famous hacker, Kevin Mitnick. But first, I want to introduce the rest of our community roundtable. Up first is NetApp's very own VP and Chief Information Security Officer, Seth Cutler. Next, I want to introduce Jody Tyrus, Technical Account Manager at VMware. I'd also like to introduce Melissa Palmer, Senior Technologist in the Office of the CTO at Veeam. And finally, I'd like to introduce Andrew Belsick, Director of Information Security Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Dick's Sporting Goods. Thank you all for joining us. As a quick reminder, for more information about our guests, featured speakers, and data protection strategies, please visit ntap.com/protect. And now I'd like to introduce Kevin Mitnick. There really is no one else like Kevin. He was and still is the most elusive computer break-in artist in history. and we'll get a chance to hear from him today. Kevin's reputation as the world's most famous hacker precedes him. Kevin is now the CEO of Mitnick Security, and his global ghost team of ethical hackers maintains a 100% successful record in their ability to penetrate the security of any system they are paid to hack into, using a system of technical exploits and social engineering. Also in his role as Chief Hacking Officer at KnowBe4, he endorses and produces the world's #1 security awareness training and platform bearing his name. So let's jump right into it, Kevin. Many of us know the story of your exploits, but let's roll the clock back just a little bit. How'd you even get started in hacking?
Well, it's kind of unusual. I got started in hacking from my love of magic. And when I was a young boy, around 10 years old, I used to ride my bicycle to a local magic shop in a suburb of Los Angeles after school and on the weekends. And I'd watch these guys, these sales guys in the magic shop, perform these tricks over and over and over again. My mom was a single mother raising me, and she had actually 2 waitressing jobs in Los Angeles. So Kevin had to find things to do on, pretty much my time. And my mom couldn't afford to buy me these tricks or these illusions, but I wanted to always learn the secret. I wanted to get the bite of the forbidden fruit of knowledge. So fast forward into high school, I'm about 15 years old and I'm a freshman. And I met this kid who could do magic with the telephone system. He had this hobby of phone phreaking, and phone phreaking is kind of the predecessor to hacking. And he showed me these really cool tricks, kind of like magic tricks, that there was a secret number you could dial called ANI, and a computerized voice would read back the number you're calling from. Now, mind you, this is in the 1970s. So this was kind of like high tech for that time. Other numbers he'd give me that, where I can call a number and it'd ring back the phone. But more interestingly, these phone company test lines. One of them was called the loop around, where you can call on one number, a friend could call on another, and you'd be magically joined. But really, which really fascinated me was where I listened to this kid, pretty much at lunchtime, at recess, and he'd be on the payphone in the school, and he'd be impersonating phone company employees, calling departments within the phone company, and basically getting any information he wanted. And this was where I first learned about the technique of social engineering. So he knew the terminology, he knew the lingo, he can get people's unlisted numbers. If he had the phone number, he can get the name and address. He can get these phone company technicians to go onto a phone company switch and actually change class features, like add custom calling features to a line. And I was a prankster back then, and I loved doing pranks because I was also, again, into the magic, into pranksterism. And one of my favorite pranks was to change the line class code in the phone company switch of a friend's home phone, right? So whenever his parents tried to make a call, it would say, please deposit 25 cents. So then my friend would call me and say, change it back, I'm gonna get grounded. I'd change it to a prison phone, collect calls only. So I really got interested in this whole area of telephony and phone phreaking. I was also an amateur radio operator, which is ham radio. So another friend in high school says, hey, Kevin, they're starting a computer programming course, this semester, maybe you'd be interested. And at the time, I wasn't so interested in that. I was really into the phone phreaking and amateur radio. But I went ahead and I met the computer science instructor. And as soon as I met this guy, he goes, you're a senior? No, freshman. He goes, have you had calculus? No. Have you had trigonometry? No. Have you had biology 2? No. And he goes, I'm sorry, you don't meet the prerequisites. You come back when you're a senior. I can't let you into the class. So then let me take you back to the computer room. The computer room was, on the side of the classroom. It had an Olivetti 110 baud terminal. Now that's 10 characters a second, so people would be very unhappy operating at that speed today. And it had a Commodore 64 and a VIC-20. And how students would access the school system is they'd dial up to a PDP 1170 running the RISC-C operating system. This is a predecessor to Digital's VMS. They'd put the handset in the acoustic coupler modem, and they would go ahead and log into the computer. So the phone that they would use to dial into the school system didn't have a phone number on it. So the instructor goes, hey, I'd love for my wife to be able to call me during lunchtime. Could you get me that phone number on the phone? And I go, sure. And I dial the secret number, the computerized voice reads it back, and I give it to this guy, and he goes, "That's fantastic." And he goes, "You know what? I'm going to waive the prerequisites and allow you into my class." And I'm sure today, as we're talking here in this event, he still regrets that decision. So the first programming assignment he gave the class was to write a Fortran program to find the first 100 Fibonacci numbers. I go, that's not so interesting. It's not fun. I got to think of something cooler. So remember I told you the setup where they dial up to the school system, to the PDP-11. I noticed that the teacher and the students, because they were using the same system, when they would dial up, they would just leave they would dial up once in the day, and then someone would go up to the terminal, they'd type in their login credentials, do their work, type log out, and the next person would use it. And then I thought, what if I could write a program that simulates the operating system, so when a student or the instructor would go to log in, they wouldn't be talking to the OS, they'd be talking to my program. It would happily accept their credentials, go ahead and log them in, save their credentials in the file for me for later, and they wouldn't know any better. So I spent a lot of time, because this is my first program, by the way. I never wrote like a program, print hello world. So I spent a lot of time at a local college called Cal State University Northridge, a local university, reading the manuals of how to do syscalls with the operating system and this sort of thing. And it took me about a good week to perfect the code. And I actually ran it on the school system, and I was able to get about 80% of the students' credentials. But the best thing I was able to get was the teacher's credential. So the very next day, the instructor is walking up to each individual student's desk to collect the Fibonacci assignment. He gets up to my desk, and he goes, "Where's your assignment?" I said, "Didn't have time to do it." He goes, "I stuck my neck out, allowed you into my class, and you're not even doing the work." I said, "Well, I wrote a cooler program." He goes, "What are you talking about?" I go, "Isn't your password Johnco?" And he goes, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. How in the heck did you get my password?" I said, "Well, I wrote a program to steal it, and I'm going to turn this program instead I'm going to turn this in instead of the Fibonacci assignment." And I hand him the printout on green bar printout. And this is how, this is back in the 70s. He takes a look, source code, obviously, and he goes, "This is awesome." He gets this huge smile on his face. He shares the code with the other students in class, and he gives me a bunch of pats on the back. So this was the ethics taught to young Kevin Mitnick, that it's cool to hack.
Very, very nice. Great context. But Kevin, let's fast forward right today. And we see obviously exploits and breaches have evolved way past that level. What are some of the gaps or mistakes that you see corporations doing today, in contrast to how you even got started in this space?
Yeah, the 70s to 2021. Well, you mentioned earlier on the program this big, huge issue with ransomware. And I think a lot of orgs, at least that I test in my security testing firm, don't do any planning. They're only reactive instead of proactive. They're not following best security practices. And especially with ransomware, companies are not actually testing the process of doing a backup and restoration process. They're actually doing their backups, and they're just hoping that will save them in the future. But they're not actually planning it out. They're not thinking about how long would it take to restore our network. Because when you're dealing with offsite backups, that could take days, weeks, and months, depending on the amount of data. So they're not thinking about it. How about live databases where you have a bunch of SQL transactions that are live? Have they actually tested this process of restore? And if they didn't do it, it could become a problem. Are the applications needed to restore the data, are those encrypted? Have those been deleted by the intruder? How about the encryption keys if you're encrypting your backups? And how are companies actually prioritizing what systems to restore? Because a lot of organizations I deal with, they have like 1,000 servers. They have a bunch of, obviously have a huge database for them. What does the business need to restore to get up and running? Have they actually figured this out? Have they actually done a tabletop exercise, or even gone through the process of actually testing this? And when it goes to encrypted data, ransomware encrypting a company's data, how are they architecting their backups? I recently finished a pen test, and I could actually as a domain administrator, connect to the backup server, and I have access to all the backups. So I could delete them, I could encrypt them. What about setting up like a logical air gap? So if somebody gets into the network, that backup network is segmented. What about immutable data? So when you back up that data, that even an administrator can't tamper with the data, and especially admins. Admins usually have privileges to whatever appliance, or if you're backing up to a vault, to actually say how long that backup's going to, how long you doing the backup retention for. Can a bad actor get those administrative credentials and actually change that backup retention period? Could they simply just zero out the device? So you have to think about these things. And one of the most important things I think also organizations need to really consider is data exfiltration. When we're doing security testing, every pen test we do, we exfiltrate data as part of the pen testing process. And pretty much none of the companies that we test actually discover it until we actually report it to them. Yep. So that really concerns me, because bad actors exfiltrate data. The targets are, pretty much have no visibility into the data. So how does a company actually monitor and investigate those types of events? If 50 gigabytes of data are leaving your network out to Russia at 3 in the morning, are you going to see it? So right. I think companies really need to prepare, they need a plan, and they need to do tabletop exercises to actually prepare for a ransomware event. So that way they could recover quickly if it happens.
Absolutely. And Melissa, I know this has been a hot topic for you. Why is DR testing such a barrier for some organizations? Is it a resource issue? Is it a cost issue? Is it a culture issue? What's the big barrier to DR testing?
Yeah, and honestly, Greg, it's a little bit of everything. I remember the DR test of, hey, let's lock ourselves in the data center for a weekend, and we're going to test a couple servers here and there, so hopefully we can check the box and please the auditors, right? So first of all, it's a ton of time and effort to shut down IT for a weekend, get everybody in the data centers, and we're not even testing things accurately. So that kind of brought a culture of dreading the DR test and maybe blowing it off and designing these tests that are based on compliance, not can you actually recover. Really, a ransomware recovery plan is a disaster recovery plan that is fully documented, fully tested, because guess what, guys? Ransomware is a total disaster these days, and it's not if, it's when.
That's absolutely correct. And it boggles my mind about how that isn't like part core to the culture. And Seth, I'll ask you, obviously from the seat that you sit in, from a CISO perspective, do you want to reflect on that role of DR testing from a mindset perspective of maybe not reflecting on NetApp necessarily, but just in general with organizations about how they prioritize that testing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be baked into the DNA. You can't have a situation where people were thinking about disasters being earthquake, meteor, solar flares kind of thing. As Melissa said, ransomware is a not if but when. You've got to create an environment where you're going through that exercise, you're putting it in muscle memory. Kevin talked about tabletop exercises, right? You've got to put the company through its paces and test all of these things out and have a very open dialogue about what your capabilities are. Do you have folks on retainer that can be at the ready, pick up the phone, to have forensics folks, to have outside counsel, to have law enforcement at the ready? We've talked about specifically with ransomware, are companies talking about paying, right? Is that something that has been openly discussed? Are you legally allowed to do so? Is there a culture in place to say, you know what, as a philosophically speaking, we're not going to pay. We're against that. So these are the conversations that have to happen up front.
Absolutely. And Jody, I know that you've got deep expertise across your career in the InfoSec space. How is your opinions or views of disaster recovery? And I'm particularly interested in testing as well in this context. How have your views evolved?
When I first started, all these different groups within IT, especially at large organizations, were working in silos, and we didn't work well together. You had the people working in desktop, you had the people working on the server team, you had the people working sometimes at the help desk and in security and network, and we were all doing our own thing. And you had to evolve. You couldn't continue to do things the same way you used to. I tweeted out this morning that your adversaries are evolving, and if you don't, you're just going to get hurt, and you're going to get hurt bad. There was the old assumption that as long as you kept that firewall nice and hard, no one would get in, and you had a lot of soft GUI interior. And then it was you can't ignore the business side of it. It's not all about technology. It's about what you're protecting and what the business thinks is the most important. When Seth talks about, if you're going to pay the ransomware, originally, I was, I remember getting hit one time. I'm like, we're not going to pay. And this is back when the sophistication of these attacks were, much less than they are today. And it was really easy to recover. So, why pay? But when you get your manufacturing system hit, and you might be, down, hundreds of $1,000s for every hour that you're down, it's not simply an IT call, what you're going to do. You need to involve the business. There needs to be those discussions ahead of time to figure out what the correct step is to maintain, your core operations.
Fantastic. And Andrew, I kind of look at, obviously you're working in the retail space, and I imagine just optically looking at the diverse footprint that retail organizations have, just by the nature of their disparity or the geographic separation of the different locations. I imagine the challenge for DR testing at that scale is much more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole litany of things that go into this. One thing that I would say is, not specific to retail, just, any companies that are, investing, prioritizing, keeping pace with tech are, we live in a DevOps world. We're not old traditional waterfall anymore. And a lot of talk and thought is around how, reliably are you engineering systems? And, if a disaster happens, quote unquote, you'll just fell over to your hot redundancy. And that's not how this works in a ransomware scenario, right? We're going back to traditional kind of DR 101 of recovering from a vaulted backup, whether that's cloud-based tape, whatever you may have. So I think that's one important distinction in the DevOps space. Retail specifically, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into both prevention and response in this space, just because, as you mentioned, Greg, distributed environment. So what do things like network segmentation look like? What do things like security awareness programs look like? And understanding the distinct risks that different types of roles in the companies play, and then ultimately from a recovery perspective, yeah, what's our posture, from a corporate perspective, what's our posture from a distributed, stores perspective? Yeah, there's a lot of planning and thought and energy that goes into all of those things.
Absolutely. Kevin, recently we saw the Colonial Pipeline hack, and a lot of, it set off, I think, a lot of concern, but also a lot of constructive conversations on how could this happen? How could this happen to critical infrastructure? And there's a variety of opinions around this, and a lot of hot takes on this. Kevin, I'd be curious from your perspective, and I'm going to open this up. I think you have a demo for us that you can reflect on just how easy these attacks can happen.
Yeah, well, unfortunately with Colonial Pipeline, it was really a simple attack because they had poor password management processes in place. And as we all know, we have a ton of data breaches out there, and a lot of these data breaches are aggregated, and bad actors could search these data breaches for credentials. And when they search them for credentials, they're obviously going to try it. In Colonial Pipeline's case, there was a credential from a data breach that actually worked for their legacy VPN. So that was the foot in the door for the bad actors to get at least into the network. And then obviously they did further exploitation to get to endpoints to deploy their ransomware payload. So how easy is it for bad actors to find credentials in data breaches? And mind you, I've actually tested this personally because I do security testing, and I found my clients, that they've been susceptible to having credentials leak. It's not only just credentials, it's the patterns that people use, that they might not have the same password, but at least you could discern the pattern, and that pattern could be useful for a bad actor to further their attack. So actually, let me show you how this works real quick. So I'm going to share my screen. First thing I want to show you is how quickly bad actors could crack passwords. Now, typically a bad actor will get into the network, they'll escalate privileges, and then they'll dump the password hashes for the entire organization. And then once they have password hashes, they could use tricks like what we call pass the hash. But why they want the credentials is to get access to data like through web applications and so on and so forth, because credentials are king for any bad actor. So what I want to do is demonstrate first how quickly we can crack a password. So Greg, I want you to think, give me a word, just pick an English word, if you will.
I'll tell you what,
if you don't mind.
Let's let Jody pick out a word. Go ahead, Jody.
Sure, Jody, give me a word.
I'm kind of scared now.
Give me, well, I mean, what's your password,
Whiskey.
Jody? We can try with that. No, I'm just kidding.
Whiskey. Whiskey.
Whiskey. Okay, great. So who else can participate? Just give me 2 digits, 2 numbers.
33.
Okay, and somebody else give me 2 symbols.
!!
Okay, it's funny. Most people pick that, interestingly enough, because it's the first 2 on the on the 1 and 2. But anyway, that aside, let's go ahead and convert this to leet speak. So we're going to convert that password to make it harder for a bad actor to guess. And hopefully you can see this. You can see that we've converted the whiskey 33 at bang to the leet speak version of that credential. So let's go ahead and we're going to highlight that. And that's our password. How easy is it for a bad actor to crack that credential? So let me go over here to my demo. What we're going to do is I'm going to put in that credential here. It's going to echo it back so we can see everything. And what happens is Windows doesn't store the plain text credential in Active Directory. They store what we call the NTLM hash. NTLM hash is right here. So what bad actors do is they can gain access to the domain and dump those hashes. Let's see how quickly we could crack the hash to get back to the original password. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run. And this is an 8 GPU cracker. So I can get about—
This is real time, right?
Real time. I could get about 500 to about 900 billion tries a second. So it's super fast. But as that's running, because we don't want to get bored waiting for this to finish, we're going to go over here to a site that I set up. It's called XKeyscore, kind of giving kudos to the NSA's spying apparatus. And what we're going to do with XKeyscore is I am able to aggregate a bunch of data breaches out here. So let's take a look at Colonial Pipeline. Their domain is coalpipe.com. We're going to go ahead and search and see if we could find any plain text credentials. So up here we have 1, but let's scroll down. We have a few here. This might be a valid credential, right? Because it's actually difficult. You know, it's not an easy password like Jake12345. But as we scroll through, here are what we call password hashes. So what bad actors do is they'll enrich their database by cracking those hashes. But as we go further into the database, and there'll be tons of these, here are valid credentials. Well, not valid. These are potentially valid credentials that a bad actor could potentially use. Like, for example, Jennifer1, what's the chance that that user might have Jennifer2, Jennifer3, Jennifer4, right? So you kind of get the idea. If we just scroll down here and you look at the bottom, we have about 12,000 potential credentials. Now, some of these are blank, so let's divide that in half. Let's say 5,000 to 6,000. That is a big pool to choose from. So this is exactly what bad actors do, is they look at these aggregated data breaches. Let's go back to our password cracking process. Here we go, it actually finished. And it started at 10:47:14. It finished literally, you know, what are we talking about? 11 seconds later, right? 10:47:25, and it actually cracked the hash. So here's the hash, right? And here's the plain text credential. So think about it. In your organization, bad actor dumps your domain credentials. How quickly can they crack people's passwords and then leverage that to further their abuse? So this is the type of tradecraft that they use, Greg.
Amazing. I'm surprised that everybody hasn't just logged off this call right now and run over to go double check their credentials. But so Kevin, you showed us the problem, you showed us the exploit. What's the workaround around this? What are some of the best practices that we need to be thinking about as to prevent exactly what you showed us?
Well, I'm sure you heard this song and dance before. everything external, MFA. Now, just because you're using MFA doesn't mean a bad actor cannot compromise you, because we have techniques we could use when we're doing phishing attacks. Even though a target is using MFA, we're able to target them in a phish and actually steal their session key so we could log into all the applications they're logged into. So it's definitely not the silver bullet, but absolutely everyone needs to do it. I think it goes to password management. I'm hoping that 3-5 years from now, we are not even using passwords anymore. We're using different technologies that right now are pretty much like, out there, like Trusana. Microsoft has some passwordless technologies, and other companies. Hopefully we're going in that direction. But for now, we should train users to use a password manager. And I think credentials, at least in a domain Active Directory environment, should at least be 20 characters as part of the password policy. You don't have to enforce symbols. You don't have to enforce uppercase, lowercase, or numbers, just a 20-character credential. And that what forces people to do is actually create a passphrase, or even 25 characters. Like, I had my vaccination on Wednesday, something like that, a complete sentence. Because if we're dealing with a credential like that, a passphrase, we're not going to be able to crack that anytime soon with a password cracker.
Wow. So much to think about here. And we've talked a lot about the technology side of this. I'd like to talk about this from a cultural perspective. And Seth, I'll kind of toss it over to you. I'm just curious about the balance of the time of effort that you spend. Obviously, you've got the technical side of this, but you've also got the education and the cultural aspect for this. Is there a clean balance of how much you spend on the technical side of it versus the cultural side?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as opposed to balance. I don't see it as a balance. I see this as constantly evolving, right? So we take the people, process, and technology. Well, people are first. They're the human firewall, but they are far from perfect. So you've got to focus on the awareness part of that. The administrator, the physical, the technical controls always have to be there. So Kevin talked about multi-factor authentication, right? You have to put those layers, those defense in depth in place to make it a little bit more difficult. You've got to surround the users with those technologies so that they can't be or make it more difficult to be compromised. We're regularly speaking in various channels to educate our internal, like even this session here, right? This is about education and awareness. We did something recently. We did a business email compromise that was targeting internally the treasury group, where wire fraud is a big topic. So we tailor our training towards specific groups as well. You've got to put those things in place. There's no silver bullet. You've got to combine education with those other controls around it.
Absolutely. And I'm ashamed to say I fell victim to one of those tests just the other day. And I think I'm pretty good and have a common sense mentality about that. But it really talks to the diligence that you need about understanding where you're getting emails from, what the source of those links are, and not just taking what you see at face value for any of our communications. So I appreciate you stumping the chump, Seth, on that last week. But Andrew, I'll bounce it back over to you. We talk about, and Kevin showed, some of these exploits and other things. What are some of the cultural things that are top of mind to you? Because, as Seth mentioned, there is so much education that goes into developing best practices. And as Seth talked about, that human firewall.
Yeah, so I think, again, just kind of that evolution, as Seth mentioned. This isn't a one-shot deal. This isn't a one and done. Do one annual security awareness training, do one phishing campaign. It has to evolve into much more than that. I've in the past and currently, you kind of manage this almost like a marketing campaign. You have a calendar. You hit different folks with different levels of responsibility in the organization with access to different things, and therefore there's a different risk if they're the one that's compromised by clicking the phish. So just all in touch points, whether that's capture the flag exercises for software engineers, whether that's multiple phishing exercises and focusing on, quote unquote, problem users, whether that's, security awareness, newsletters and guidelines. And I think it's important too in the phishing campaigns, balancing both, kind of the carrot and the stick of, yes, obviously you want to identify, click happy users and appropriately train them, but you also want to use the carrot approach as well, and put forth the good behavior and incentivize that as well. So things like, whether that's giveaways or recognition or whatever that may be, there's a million different ways to do it. But I think just the evolution, the multi-pronged approach, and then remembering, both carrot and stick approach as well.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic. Jody, I'm just wondering, and I'm kind of picking on you here. Do you have any we don't need to name names, but I'm just curious, do you have any kind of horror stories? I'm sure everybody's got InfoSec horror stories. Any clever ones or anything you're comfortable sharing? Again, no names.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I've worked at companies that, you're not like these, you're not out in the news all the time, and you can have people that become a little lax in their understanding of, how big of a target you are. But yeah, I've had to deal with issues where, phishing is obviously, the biggest one, but I've had to deal with incidents where, there's phishing, and then there's spear phishing, and then there's whaling, and people are really good at digging for information. And let's be honest, we put a lot of information out there on publicly accessible, sites. We've got our stuff on LinkedIn. We've got, stuff on Facebook. We're telling people, we've got a new job here and we've got a new job there. It's so simple to, find out naming conventions for emails and accounts. To Kevin's point, we're talking about passwords and the length of passwords. I've always thought that the IDs, how hard is it to find out what my ID is at every company I've ever worked for? It's not that hard. It's usually going to be, first initial, last name up to a certain number of characters. And I've always said, pontificated for years about, you got to use something different, something that is a little less out there and easily guessable. But yeah, there's a number of horror stories. Luckily, I've worked with some great teams over the years, and we've been able to do what I call these diving catches. Sometimes it's, easy, to do those, and other times it's after the fact, to the point I think someone mentioned about, in your Rolodex, and that might be dating me a little bit, do you have the number for your local law enforcement? Who are you going to call when stuff like this happens? Who are you going to work with internally, whether it's your legal department, your risk management department? There's a lot of things to consider, but we had, an easy one where, wire transfers, and people are new to their position, and maybe they, are so eager to please that they hustled something through and it ended up biting them. But it's there's so many. It's really hard to stop without get myself in trouble. But there's a lot out there, and they're not always the best hacker in the world at you. A lot of times it's just, somebody going for the low-hanging fruit. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there.
Absolutely. And I just want to remind everybody, if you want to go to ntap.com/protect, we got more information about our featured speakers and our roundtable participants, and some additional information around data protection. And real quick, Kevin, I one of the things, I've read your book and watched a number of your videos. One of the most amusing stories is the FBI donuts story. It's almost like when you hear the story, and people are going to think it's almost like a catch me if you can type of scenario. Do you want to share or reshare the FBI donut story that you had?
Sure. This is back in 1992, so we're almost at 30 years ago. So it's quite some time. But at the time when I was a black hat, I was working on obviously invading law enforcement. To make a long story short, there was an informant that was working with the FBI against me, and I was actually doing some counterintelligence work to figure out what was going on. And in that process, I was able to identify the phone numbers of this particular squad in the Los Angeles office of the FBI. And I was able to get pretty much, I think they had like 6 agents assigned to the white collar crime squad 3 in that office. I was able to obtain their cell phone numbers. And then I had a device that I was able to interface with a Radio Shack scanner to monitor the forward control channel of my local cell site. And at the time, I was working as a private investigator in Los Angeles. And in my office, I set up the scanner, I set up the interface to the computer, and it was kind of my early warning detection system for the FBI. So if any of those phones registered at the cell site in my area, it would actually alert me on the computer. Because don't forget, as you're traveling throughout your city, your cell phone is being handed off to different cell sites. It's kind of how the government tracks people nowadays as well. So I remember one morning I went into the office quite early and I disabled the alarm. And then I was walking away from the alarm and I kept hearing this beeping sound. And then I was confused because I just disabled it. I end up walking to my office and the sound is getting louder. And I walk up to the computer and oh my God, the FBI early warning system tripped. One of the FBI cell phones was actually locally in the area. And when I talk about locally in the area, this was in the city called Calabasas, California, you're talking within about a half a mile. So I did not think it was coincidence. And then I was thinking, they're in the area. And then I was able to look at what phone numbers were called from that particular FBI number that was local. And it was actually the payphone that was across the street from my apartment. and I'm going, oh my God, they're at the apartment. What are they doing? Are they surveilling me? Are they spying on me? What the heck is going on? And they weren't there to arrest me because obviously they could have just knocked on the door and here I am. So then I thought about it and I go, oh, I know what they're going to do. They're going to get a search warrant. So they're there just to get a description of the premises because they have to get a court order, obviously, from a federal judge to search the premises, and they need a description of this. So immediately I went home after this. I made sure there was no surveillance, and I removed anything that the FBI would be interested in. Computers, floppy disks. Yes, floppy disks. This was quite 30 years ago. And I moved it over to some other location, and then I was pretty much a smartass. So I had to think, what would be to me like a prank to pull on the FBI. So what I did is I went to the local Winchell's Donut House and I bought a dozen donuts in a pink box. I had a Sharpie and I wrote FBI donuts on the box. I put them into the refrigerator. And then on a big Post-it note outside the refrigerator, the Intel logo, Intel inside,
yep.
I put Mitnick inside. And I just left it on the refrigerator. And I didn't expect this to happen. I figured it was going to be 3 days, 5 days a week. But the very next morning, 6 a.m, I hear somebody jiggling my lock on my front door. I jump out of bed and I, just reactionarily yelled, "Who is it?" And FBI, open up. And so I opened the door. All these agents pour into my small apartment and they're searching around looking for computers and computer, devices like disks and whatever. And they don't find a thing. So they're very annoyed. And they sit me down at a table, and then it took them a while. And then one of the agents actually looked at the refrigerator and saw that Post-it note. So they actually looked inside the refrigerator and saw the box of donuts that said FBI donuts. So obviously they were pretty pissed.
I bet. Did they eat the donuts?
No, not one. They left them all. So obviously I was letting them know that I knew that they were going to do the search. So they were very unhappy at the time. But I was a little bit insane at the time. I was, playing Catch Me If You Can back when I was a younger adult, 30 years ago.
Yeah. And Melissa, I'm quite certain that you don't have an FBI donut story. I'm just curious if you've got any reflections and kind of bizarre scenarios that you've seen with some of the customers and clients or people in the industry that you've worked with.
Yeah. And a lot of it comes back to recovery and recovery testing, right? People have been getting better over and over when it comes to DR planning and testing. And a lot of people will test an application here and there instead of just a server. And that is a huge leap forward. But what people aren't doing, this goes back to some of what Kevin's been saying, is, those tabletop recovery drills. You really need to do almost a full scale recovery test. If you've been ransomware, your backups are going to be your last line of defense. So you need to know that you can confidently restore everything from soup to nuts, right? Even if you've paid that ransom and been decrypted, I really question the integrity of your data at that point. So you're still in a situation where you really need to start from zero and rebuild. And really, We've come so far in the last couple of years, but the only way to do this is really automation and orchestration, right? Automate that documentation, automate that testing, and automate that recovery. So when the day comes, you can just kind of click that button and be ready to go and know with confidence that, hey, we can recover from this because we have actually legitimately tested it. We've tested recovery, not trying to pass a DR test for compliance.
Absolutely. And a fantastic reminder for all of us. But Melissa, you just talked about ransomware and recovery. Let's assume that you haven't done your homework, you haven't done your testing, you haven't protected yourself. Kevin, I know I'm cheating here because I know the answer. I saw you on CNBC a couple of weeks ago. Do you have a golden rule on paying hackers or not paying hackers if you've been ransomware?
I think it's up to the business owner. And the reason being is if I'm a business owner and if I'm going to be down for a week and it's going to destroy my business, I might consider taking the risk and actually paying the ransom. Do I want to pay the ransom? Absolutely not. I don't want to reward the criminals at all. But unfortunately, businesses have a choice, whether they're going to take the chance, take the risk that they could recover their data, at least get up and operational until they could fully recover. So I don't think the government should regulate and say absolutely not. Of course, the Department of Treasury, if that group is on a sanction list, that would actually be a criminal offense, and companies need to be aware of that. But I think it really has to be up to the business owner. And unfortunately, it drives that ecosystem of ransomware because if you're paying the bad guys, they're just going to keep doing it, pretty much over and over and over again because it's a profitable business. So that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely. I want to go around the horn here as we wrap up with everybody. But real quick, I got one more question to slide in. Maybe it was a month or two ago, Jody, we had a kind of an online conversation on Twitter about one phone or two phones, one personal, one for work. Jody, you had convinced me that, from your experience, it was probably a good best practice to have a personal phone and a work phone from a privacy and security perspective. Kevin, I'm going to point to you to help give us some definitions. Do you have one phone, two phones, three phones? How many phones do you have? And is it because of security and privacy?
Yeah, well, I have multiple phones. I pretty much use iPhone. If you're really interested in privacy with mobile devices, I suggest you immediately go to Google and Google the NSO group. It's pretty much making the news over the last couple of days about this Israeli firm who is really adept at compromising mobile devices, and they're targeting, obviously heads of state. So with that aside, I actually have a different cell number and a different phone for all my password resets. Because of the risk of SIM swapping and because I'm such a huge target, everyone could easily get my main cell phone number. It's actually, you can look it up on Google. I don't hide it. But I do have some private numbers that are prepaid devices that are for password resets only. So if somebody were to SIM swap my number and try to do a password reset, they're not going to have much luck.
Got it. Great insight there. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to go around the horn. And Seth, I'm going to start with you. This has been an outstanding conversation. So first, I want to thank all of our roundtable participants here. Seth, can you give us one key takeaway?
One key takeaway. So no other industry is like this, right? We see the regulatory space coming down heavy, both the Biden administration, worldwide, GDPR and so forth. We're seeing vulnerabilities in supply chain. So this is a ever evolving type state that we're in. So security needs to be top of mind. You need to create an ecosystem of tools and talent, like we talked about, that is not static. You've got to continue to test and retest and test again in order to prove out that you're doing the right things.
Awesome. And I see Melissa nodding while you're saying that. Andrew, I will go to you next. Give us one key takeaway.
Yeah, I think just from a governance perspective, as much as you feel like the views aren't as myopic in this space, but still need a reminder that all of this stuff, ransomware, vulnerabilities, security, they're not security problems, they're not technology problems, they're business problems. And if these aren't things that your boards are talking about on a frequent basis, certainly not at this level of granularity, but if it's not something the board's talking about, or it's not something your executives are talking about, you need to get them talking about it, because at the end of the day, these are business problems, not technology problems.
Absolutely. Jody, I'm going to go to you next.
My number one takeaway is just start something, start protecting something, and look at the tools that are already in your tool chest, whether it's patch management, asset management, your two-factor system, your privilege account management. Odds are, if you're a decent enough size organization, you have these. Maybe you haven't implemented them fully. Maybe you haven't enfolded them into your strategy as far as protection against ransomware, but you have these tools. So get those teams involved and start planning, start something.
Absolutely. And Melissa, I suspect your one key takeaway is going to have something to do with
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with Jody on this one. Just start. Remember, ransomware is a disaster. And even if you have some type of disaster recovery plan right now, it might not be tested, it might be updated, but that is your starting point. And, a cyber disaster is much more likely maybe than the zombies eating your servers in your data center, right? Because the apocalypse has come and it's the Walking Dead. But it's really time to kind of start, like Jody said, and start with what you have in house. Start with those DR plans. It's time to update them, automate them, and actually test that recovery like you would be recovering from ransomware, right? Not the silly test where you boot a server and say, okay, we're good, everybody hug and go home. Really thoroughly test everything.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melissa. Kevin, bring us home. If there's one key takeaway, when we think about the enterprise, what's a key takeaway you'd like to see everybody walk away with?
That's hard to say one, and the uncomfortable truth is we're in a crisis right now. If bad actors want to compromise the business, I have no doubt they could do it because they have unlimited time and resources. And you have to think about the ransomware attacks these days. They're getting paid tens of millions of dollars. You could actually set up an entire business of security researchers. You could have your own human resources office, based out of Moscow or St. Petersburg. So these bad actors are extremely sophisticated and extremely well funded. So it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And what Melissa spoke about earlier about orchestration and automation, considering getting a SOAR platform where you have security orchestration, automation, and response, that should be a consideration. But I think the biggest takeaway here is test, harden, train. Test, do your security testing, penetration testing, test your recovery processes, and do it thoroughly. Harden, reduce that attack surface. After your security testing, you'll see what the gaps are, and then you can go ahead and configure your environment to reduce that attack surface. And absolutely what Seth said earlier, security awareness training. I mean, I'm really focused on it. I'm the chief hacking officer of KnowBe4, right? So do your simulated phishing, lower that phish-prone percentage to something that's acceptable, like single-digit numbers, and then just keep repeating that cycle of test, harden, train, because it's dynamic, it's not static. Just like Andrew said, it's not one and done. You have to actually keep up with the cycle. So again, test, harden, train, test, harden, train, test, harden, train.
Test, harden, train. I got it. It's burned in. I just want to remind everybody too, before we wrap up here, please visit ntap.com/protect if there's additional information about our speakers and data protection strategies. And I want to thank, first of all, Seth, Andrew, Melissa, and Jody for being participating on this, being good sports about this, sharing your good insights. And Kevin, can't say enough. Thank you so much. Great stories, great insight, and looking forward to doing more with you in the future as we try to drive these conversations and really create and drive an understanding of what the real threats are and the options and tools and the knowledge that we all need to manage that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to you joining our next Ready Set. Thank you.
Thank you.